Good afternoon and welcome to a webinar on distilling FSMA, alcohol beverages, and the FDA. Today's webinar is co-presented by EAS Independent Advisor for FSMA, Charles Breen, and Senior Attorney at Learman Beverage Law, John Messenger. Charles Breen joined EAS as an independent advisor after a distinguished career at FDA, working in areas such as HACCP, LACF, excuse me, let me change the slide, such as HACCP, LACF, and BIC prohibited materials and dairy. Mr. Breen has worked with industry on compliance issues related to bioterrorism of 2003 and led the field and headquarters professionals in developing and implementing surveillance and compliance programs and initial FSMA training implementation. His attention to detail has garnered him an FDA Award of Merit, Outstanding Achievement, and 5 commissioner citations. John Messenger is an attorney at Learman Beverage Law. John focuses on Ttb labeling and formulation matters, as well as state compliance issues. John has a particular interest in beer and craft beer issues, and he is an avid small-scale brewer. In addition, John is conversant with wine, spirits, label, permit, and formula issues. He has expedited applications for many DSP wholesalers and import permits, and has been cited as an expert on law beverage by the New Jersey Law Council. During the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box, and we will save all questions for the end. With that, I will say thank you, and we'll turn the presentation over to Charles and John.
Thank you, Amy. Next slide. Okay, what is an alcohol beverage? The Federal Alcohol Act, and John will be talking more about this, defines it as being all beverages containing 0.5% or more alcohol by volume at any time during their manufacture. The Food and Drug Administration defines any article of food or drink for humans or animals as something under its jurisdiction. So 2 acts, 2 agencies dealing with regulatory matters. Congress didn't worry about it, but the agencies did and signed an agreement to divide the tasks and responsibilities among them to try and be efficient and to protect consumers to the extent that the law allowed. Next.
So there are a few different baskets, types of alcohol beverages. It's broken down into distilled spirits, wine, and beer. And every beverage alcohol product has to be one of these. They can't be, even if they're a mixture of 2 of them, they still would fall under one particular definition. So the first being distilled spirits, which is ethyl alcohol, hydrochloric oxide of alcohol, of ethyl, spirits of wine, whiskey, and including all dilutions and mixtures thereof. That doesn't include a blend of wine and spirits if the blend is less than or equal to 24% alcohol by volume and more than 50% wine on a proof gallon basis, meaning that most of the alcohol in the product comes from wine. If it's 24% or less, then it is classified as a wine. So basically any beverage alcohol product that contains distilled spirits or any beverage that is a distilled spirit is classified as a distilled spirit. There are products like bitters, Angostura bitters from one, or other extracts, vanilla extracts that contain ethyl alcohol, but those are not fit for beverage purposes. They have ingredients added to them to make them unfit, whether it's something like a citric acid tincture, which is basically neutral spirits with enough citric acid to make it non-potable. That ceases to become a distilled spirit, and it is not, it doesn't need Ttb label approval or is not taxed in the same way. Next is wine, which is, what most people think of wine is the natural wine is the product of juice or must of sound ripe grapes or their sound ripe fruit. That also includes agricultural wines, things like agave wine, vermouth, which is aromatized wine, wine with spirits and herbs and spices added, cider, which is generally made from apples or pears, sake, rice wine, that contains between 7% and 24% alcohol by volume. So here, this is where we start to get into the bifurcation of the jurisdiction over alcohol beverages between FDA and TTB, because the FAA Act defines wine as containing between 7% and 24% alcohol by volume. But the IRC, Internal Revenue Code, does not set a alcohol content limit. So certain wines are under FDA's jurisdiction, but are still taxed the same way as wines that are under TTB's jurisdiction. Last is beer, which can be kind of confusing because there's beer and then there's malt beverages. The tax definition of beer is that it's a fermented beverage that contains at least 0.5% alcohol by volume and is brewed from malt or a substitute therefore. One such substitute can be sugar. So if you have a beer made from 100, if you have an alcohol beverage with, let's say, 6% alcohol by volume, that's made from a base of 100% sugar, it is classified as a beer for taxation purposes. The FAA Act, however, TTB's jurisdiction, defines malt beverage as a product of an alcoholic fermentation in potable water of malted barley and with hops. So if there's no malted barley or hops in your beer, it is not a malt beverage. It is taxed at the beer rate, but the labeling does not fall under TTB's jurisdiction, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. Next slide.
Yes, and as John was pointing out, the responsibilities of FDA are different from TTB's, but all alcohol beverage manufacturers must register with FDA as a food facility. They must be made in compliance with FDA's current good manufacturing practice regulations. And with respect to alcohol beverages, it's primarily the sanitation, cleanliness, employee hygiene, and the use of unadulterated ingredients. Now, I could spend all day talking about GMPs, but suffice it to say for today's webinar, sanitation, cleanliness, hygiene, and unadulterated ingredients will suffice. Alcohol beverages are exempt from preventive controls, the foreign supplier verification program, and low-acid canned food regulations. They are specifically exempted in the regulations themselves. So GMPs, yes. Most other requirements for food, no. Next.
Okay. So TTB has jurisdiction over all domestic production of alcohol beverages, and that includes products that are under FDA's labeling jurisdiction. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it's sometimes surprising to some that FDA regulates my wine, the labeling and advertising of my wine, because it's under 7% alcohol by volume. But it still must be produced at a bonded winery if it's produced in the United States, which means the producer has to have a TTB permit. They need to have formula approval for the product. If it's required, they pay taxes, etc. So anyone producing alcohol beverages has to obtain the basic permit or a basic permit or brewer's notice prior to producing. There's a caveat here for kombucha producers. They may need either a brewer's notice or a bonded winery permit, depending on how their product is formulated, if their product goes above 0.5% alcohol by volume at any time. So if you're making kombucha and your product never hits 0.5% alcohol by volume, you don't need a TTB permit or a brewer's notice. But if it goes above and then comes back down, you still need a TTB permit or brewer's notice. One of the other responsibilities for TTB is to collect excise taxes. And I'll talk a little bit about this because we tend to get a lot of questions about excise taxes, and it can be fairly confusing. So the federal excise tax is assessed on bottled or packaged goods that are removed from bond for consumption or sale. The vast majority of the time, the permittee, the producer who is removing the goods from bond, pays that tax. They are the taxpayer as far as TTB is concerned, not the brand owner or the ultimate recipient of the alcohol beverage. It's the bottler, producer slash bottler, who's removing the product from bond that was responsible for paying the excise tax. And excise taxes are determined differently depending on the commodity. So for distilled spirits, it's determined by a proof gallon. And a proof gallon is just a liquid gallon of spirits at 50% alcohol by volume at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have an RTD, for example, that's bottled at 5% alcohol by volume, that's 10 proof, and that is 0.1 proof gallons per gallon of liquid. The tax for wine is assessed by just what they call a wine gallon. That's a normal gallon of milk style gallon. And the rate is determined by alcohol content, the level of carbonation, and in some cases, the composition of the wine. For example, like hard cider, which is derived primarily from apples or pears, it can have a higher rate of carbonation than it's like a carbonated wine, and would be taxed at a lower rate than a regular grape wine, as long as it's less than 8.5% alcohol by volume, has no fruit flavoring or ingredients of an apple or pear. But so tax for wine can vary pretty significantly if the product is sparkling or carbonated, meaning there's more than 0.392 grams of carbonation of CO2 per 100 milliliters of wine. So a wine product that has some carbonation, that's less than 0.392 grams per 100 milliliters of CO2, that product is actually a still wine, even though there may be some carbonation in it. But anything above the 0.392 is taxed at a much higher rate. And tax for beer is assessed by the barrel. A barrel is 31 gallons. Some of TTB's other responsibilities are reviewing formulations and doing lab analysis. For formulations required for certain alcohol beverage products, and they do lab analysis for others. There's trade practice enforcement, which includes Tide House, connections between the top two tiers and the retail tier. And they have responsibility for the labeling and advertising and marketing of all 7% and above wine, all distilled spirits, and all malt beverages, not necessarily all beer. TTB requires labels for most of these products to be pre-approved, and that is called a certificate of label approval. There's certain exceptions to this. Wine and spirits that are sold only in intrastate commerce, they can get a certificate of exemption, and beer sold only in intrastate commerce doesn't need a COLA at all, as long as the state does not require it. There's no pre-approval required for marketing or advertising or social media. Next.
There is a memorandum of understanding between FDA and the TTB, and it lays out for bureaucratic document in pretty clear terms who is responsible for the labeling of what kind of alcohol beverage. John was talking about others with specifics. So let me just say that if you're wondering which authority regulates the labels on a given alcohol beverage, the answer is going to be clear if enough details are available. So FDA has responsibility for the labeling of cider under 7% alcohol by volume, wine under 7%, and sugar-based hard seltzers under 7%. A malt-based hard seltzer is regulated differently than the sugar-based hard seltzers that are under 7%. Kombucha, if it never gets above 0.5 alcohol during production, at the time of bottling or after bottling, the labeling is under FDA authority. And beers made from substitutes for malted barley, such as just straight sorghum, rice, or wheat. Those beers, if they're made without hops, their labeling must comply with FDA requirements. FDA labeling requirements do not include, as John mentioned before, distilled spirits, wine with greater than 7% alcohol, most beers, those that are made with malted barley and hops. And sake is outside of FDA's labeling requirements. Next. FDA's labeling requirements are a lot different from those of TTB. If the alcohol beverage is required to conform to FDA labeling requirements, the Fair Packaging Labeling Act regulations come into play, such as a nutrition panel, a list of ingredients, allergen labeling if there are any allergens. And these regulations are both detailed and very precise in their requirements. The format recently changed on nutrition facts, but everyone needs to comply with current requirements as they are written. The best advice I can offer is if you want to develop a new product with a new nutrition label because you're under FDA authority, get expert advice. Next.
Okay, I do want to answer one quick question that came in. Who regulates imported products? So TTB has jurisdiction over the same products on an import basis too. So imported distilled spirits, that's TTB jurisdiction. You need a TTB importer's basic permit to import beer, wine, or spirits. Imported malt beverages, imported wine above 7% or above, those are all under TTB's jurisdiction. The one part we're gonna get a little unclear is, and I was gonna talk about this later, but we can talk about it now, is, for example, a flavored wine product, if it's 8%, if it's, let's say, a grape wine with cherry juice and natural cinnamon flavor. That doesn't sound all that great, but that flavored wine product. If it's 7% or above, you need TTB formula approval for that product. You don't necessarily need TTB formula approval, and sometimes TTB will refuse to issue one if that product is imported because TTB has no jurisdiction over the producer. The producer's in another country. So in general, imported products that fall under FDA's labeling jurisdiction don't necessarily need TTB formula approval. So going to TTB labeling requirements, we could probably do a hour-long presentation on just TTB labeling requirements. And a lot depends upon the specific commodity, but in general, all TTB labels need a brand name, which can be, it can be pretty much anything that's on the brand label of the container. It needs a class and type statement, which is the standard of identity for a beer, wine, or distilled spirit. For example, like bourbon, whiskey, vodka, grape wine, champagne, stout, malt liquor, etc. Or a statement of composition. So if there is a product that doesn't fall into one of TTB's defined classes and/or types, it is called a specialty, more or less, like a wine specialty, distilled spirits specialty, malt beverage specialty. Those products are labeled with a statement of composition. And there's 3 examples here on the screen. The language towards the bottom of each label, like premium malt beverage with natural flavors, or vodka with natural flavors and carbonation. Those are the statements of composition. The statements of composition disclose the base alcohols that the product is made with, any flavoring, natural or artificial, colors, artificial sweeteners, any barrel or wood aging in general. Next is the alcohol content statement. In general, it must be on all labels except for certain malt beverages that are not made with any additional alcohol content. I mean, additional ingredients that contain alcohol, which is kind of a surprise to some people that you can buy a beer and not know how much alcohol is in it. Well, if it's just like an IPA, for example, it's not made with anything other than malted barley and or hops. It does not need to have the alcohol content stated on the label. Next are net contents for wine and distilled spirits. It's in milliliters or liters, malt beverages by fluid ounces, pints, quarts, gallons, etc. Then the bottler's name and address. In general, you need to have the name and address of the responsible brewer and or bottler of the product. There are some exceptions for beer where multiple breweries are under common ownership, and you can just show, the one location, a principal place of business. And distilled spirits, if you happen to be a distillery and you are bottling for another distillery, you can use their name and principal place of business, and the products can be coded to show the actual bottler. The government warning is another labeling requirement. TTB does not allow any other health warnings. You can't say, for example, on your label, this alcohol beverage may be bad for you. Well, as long as it's not in the government warning, they don't allow it, including other foreign government health warnings. There are things that the EU requires that TTB does not allow regardless. Then, there's commodity specific information like distilled spirits, depending on what type it is. Like if it's vodka, it would need to have a commodity statement showing what commodity the product was distilled from, like distilled from grain. Certain whiskeys need to state the age if it's less than 4 years old, the state of distillation, depending on labeling information. Wine sometimes will have appellations, varietals, and a sulfite statement. So next. So we have here, there are some differences with TTB and FDA labeling. First being, FDA requires a nutrition facts panel. TTB absolutely does not require a nutrition facts panel. The only thing that you can put on your label is either a serving facts panel or a statement of average analysis that discloses the serving size, servings per container, the calories, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. A serving fact statement or statement of average analysis are only required if the label makes any claims about caloric or carbohydrate content. So if you say only 99 calories, well then TTB requires you to include a serving fact statement or statement of average analysis disclosing the calories, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Another one is like zero sugar. That is another trigger for the need of a serving fact statement or statement of average analysis. Charles, did you want to say anything about the nutrition facts panel?
Yes, the nutrition facts panel is only required on those alcohol beverages that are, excuse me, under FDA labeling authority. So if you're not going to be regulated by TTB for labels, you are going to be regulated by FDA for labels, and the nutrition panel does need to be included, even though I believe everyone is pretty well aware that alcohol beverages are not a good source of protein.
Another difference is TTB's dislike of health-related statements. So TTB doesn't really allow any health claims to appear on labels. The regulations say that label and advertisements may not contain any health-related statement that is untrue in any particular or tends to create a misleading impression as to the effects of health on alcohol consumption. And it's broken down into 3 types of statements. Health-related statements being one, which is a relationship between the consumption of the product and health benefits or effects on health Sometimes TTB can be as strict as, this hard seltzer will refresh you. They see that as a relationship between the consumption of product and a effect on health or a benefit to the consumer, and would not allow it. Another type of health-related statement is a physical or psychological sensation resulting from consuming the product. And the example I usually go to here is, drink this whiskey to warm you up on a cold winter night. You can't say TTB believes that the warming sensation is a health-related statement because it's saying that the consumer of the product will feel something from the alcohol beverage. And then another health-related statement is a statement of nutritional value. And that includes, disclosing, you couldn't say that the product is high protein, for example, even if it had 5 grams of protein in it or something. And that's allowed on the serving fact statement where you'd put the 5 grams. TTB in general would not allow you to tout the protein content of the alcohol beverage under their jurisdiction. Another area is specific health claims. That's relation of the product to a disease or condition. You couldn't necessarily say like this vodka is safe for celiac. And the last is a health-related directional claim, which something referring consumers to third parties or others to get health-related data. And Charles, does FDA see that differently?
FDA regulates health claims on foods also, and without going into the specifics, basically the manufacturer has to provide some rational basis for making a health claim. And to my knowledge, there are no health claims on any alcohol beverages subject to FDA labeling requirements.
The next difference between Ttb and Fda labeling are ingredient statements. Where they're more or less mandatory for FDA, they are not so for Ttb. They are completely optional as far as Ttb is concerned. If you do choose to include them, they must more or less mirror FDA's requirements. You must put it in, order of usage. That's not strictly enforced though. Sometimes you'll see all manner of ingredient statements, but in general, Ttb does not require them. Charles, do you have anything on FDA ingredient statements?
If it's under FDA labeling jurisdiction, yes. The ingredients must be listed in the order of predominance within the product. And it's just, and there's no difference between an FDA labeled alcohol beverage under FDA labeling authority than any other food. All the ingredients and the grouping that is allowed for some ingredients, such as spices, is still allowed in alcohol beverages. It is consistent with everything else that FDA requires labeling on.
One other difference here is what constitutes a brand label versus a principal display panel. So a brand label, as far as under Ttb jurisdiction, it's not always the front of the container what is ordinarily displayed to a consumer at retail. Basically, whatever label or portion of a label that contains all mandatory information in the same field of view can constitute a Ttb brand label. So, for example, you may see a lot of wine products where all the mandatory information is on the back label, and that's not what is presented to the consumer at retail. FDA, however, has a different view on this. And Charles, do you?
Yeah, the principal display panel has some required information. The net contents need to be declared with a specific type size related to the size of the label in the lower 30% of the principal display panel. The nutritional labeling panel, I believe, needs to be to the right of the principal display panel. And again, type size, format are specifically laid out as to how this information must be presented to consumers. The TTB requirements are less detailed in some respects, but FDAs are consistent with any other food product under FDA regulation.
And lastly, here's a few other differences between TTB and FDA labeling. One is allergen labeling, completely optional again for TTB. If you're going to include it, though, you must mirror FDA's requirements. Juice content, there's no requirement to disclose the percent of juice that is in the product for TTB. And last one here, type or WAN with other natural flavors. For compounded flavors, TTB doesn't require any additional disclosures for products that use compound flavors that are identified as type or WNF. A type flavor being like a cherry type flavor does not include any cherry flavors in it, and a WNONF with other natural flavors. Be a cherry WAN flavor would be cherry flavors, but also other fruit or flavor components in the product. For example, you can use pictures of cherries on your TTB regulated label if you use a cherry type flavor, whereas that is a little more problematic for FDA regulated alcohol beverage products or food products in general.
Yes, but just to start back on allergen labeling, if it's under FDA labeling requirements, the allergen labeling has to be in the box that declares the allergen specifically and separately from the ingredients label. If there is juice that is unfermented that remains or is added to a product, the percentage of juice must be declared in accordance with the juice content requirements and FDA's regs. With other natural flavors, well, it depends on what it is. Some things in FDA regulations need to be called out specifically. Others can be lumped together with flavors or spices. The labeling requirements can get quite detailed in the application. So don't guess. Find out or get an expert to help. Next. FDA has responsibility for ingredients that go into alcohol beverages, whether under primarily FDA labeling requirements or TTB labeling requirements. The use of a non-GRAS food additive or color requires FDA approval for use in an alcohol beverage, distilled spirit, wine, or beer, regardless of which agency has primary labeling responsibility. GRAS ingredients must be generally recognized as safe for their intended use in an alcohol beverage. A few years ago, caffeine, which is a GRAS ingredient in some products, such as colas up to 200 parts per million, is GRAS. Caffeine can be GRAS in other products as well. But the addition of caffeine to an alcohol beverage, it's not covered. It's not automatically assumed to be GRAS. The manufacturer who wishes to use such a product needs to establish that an ingredient is GRAS for the intended product. And if there are questions from TTB, FDA provides laboratory support and conducts health hazard evaluations on substances at TTB's request, such as caffeine in an alcoholic beverage. The regulatory issue really seems to be, but the substance is GRAS, why can't I use it? And the answer from FDA's perspective is, it's GRAS for what we say it's GRAS, and you have to show us otherwise, that it is GRAS in what you want to use it in. To do that can be quite expensive, and it cannot be assumed that because a substance is GRAS in one context, it will be GRAS in another. Next.
So Something that comes up a lot in terms of the interactions between TTB and FDA are through TTB formulations. So formulas are basically a recipe for the product that includes the ingredients in the production process that you would submit to TTB, that TTB would review and approve. It is a prerequisite for label approval if the formula is actually required. And formulas are generally required for the following for distilled spirits. Any flavored product like a flavored vodka, a liqueur, a distilled spirit specialty, cocktails, they all require TTB formula approval. Certain blends like a blended whiskey, adding things that are not harmless coloring, flavoring, blending materials would require a TTB formula approval. Again, for wines, most flavored products, an agave wine with lime juice and natural flavors, that's going to require a TTB formula approval. Agricultural wines, like again, an agave wine would require TTB formula approval. And for beers / malt beverages, anything that's made with a non-traditional ingredient or a process, those are all covered under TTB ruling 2015-1. There are certain herbs, spices, fruits that are deemed to be traditional. If you use, for example, apple juice in a malt beverage, you don't need to get a TTB formula approval for it. If you use a natural apple flavor or an apple extract in your beer or malt beverage, you do need TTB formula approval for it because those extracts are not considered to be traditional. So what is TTB looking for when they're reviewing a formulation? They're looking for, does this product conform to the standard of identity for which the applicant has applied? They're looking for colors and flavors being both, compounded flavors, extracts, or, whole ingredients, spices, things like that. They're looking to see if the ingredients are GRAS. Generally, TTB is not going to do an analysis as to whether the ingredient is GRAS or not. They have ingredients that they're familiar with and they know are GRAS, and then there's a bunch of others that they don't, and they put that burden back on the applicant, which I'll talk about in a second. The others are restricted and limited ingredients. There are certain ingredients that are not allowed in TTB products. They have temporarily suspended review of formulas with added vitamins and other nutrients. That temporarily has been since early 2010. TTB said that the issue of whether certain ingredients are added to alcohol beverages, whether that's GRAS or not, is up to FDA. And 11 years later, we're still kind of wondering whether these products can ever be GRAS. But in general, added vitamins or other nutrients are not allowed in alcohol beverages. There are some exceptions for things like ascorbic acid, which can also be vitamin C, because it's a preservative. If there's some other legitimate use for an ingredient, if it provides flavor, you may be able to get it approved in your alcohol beverage. Another thing about flavors, one difference with FDA is that flavors are natural or artificial depending on the amount of artificial flavor content in the compounded flavor. That excludes vanillin, ethyl vanillin, maltol, ethyl maltol. If the flavor has less than or equivalent to 1,000 parts per million of artificial flavor content, then it's deemed to be natural for TTB purposes. If it's above 1,000 parts per million artificial flavor content, then it is artificial for TTB purposes. So again, most of the burden to prove whether an ingredient is GRAS is on the applicant. TTB will push back and say, is this ingredient GRAS? Get something from FDA, and the applicant needs to email, call FDA, which is not a very quick process by and large. and get information from FDA and provide it to TTB before they will act on the ingredient and the formula approval itself. You can do, there's some research you can do on your own, of course, but it can be difficult sometimes when TTB is asking you to prove that, for example, this exotic wood is grass. Well, there's not an easy list or something that you can find to prove that it is, and then you'll have to go to FDA, and if it's not on, if FDA is not familiar with it, they're just going to say no, and you may not be able to use the ingredient that you wanted to use in your finished product. And it can be confusing sometimes to beverage producers or brand owners, especially, or developing a new product. They walk into a store and see, I can buy horny goat weed off the shelf and I can consume it. Why can't I put that in my alcohol beverage product? Well, because it's not grass. Just because you see something on a store shelf doesn't mean it's okay to put in your alcohol beverage. Caffeine, again, being the example, it's okay in cola type beverages. It is okay in TTB regulated beverages, but only if it's naturally occurring in some other ingredient. So for example, using a coffee stout, that's fine. Using, a tea infused vodka, also fine. But if you're using synthesized caffeine or adding additional caffeine, it's not grass for alcohol beverages, and TTB will not allow it. And are we on the next slide?
Before we go there, John,
Yeah.
You can get a novel substance to be considered grass if you provide the agency, with Food and Drug Administration, with sufficient information that is publicly available to show that it is generally recognized as safe. And when a sponsor wishes to have an ingredient listed as grass, the agency doesn't approve these. What it does is it responds to the sponsor with, usually one of three ways. Either say, we have no questions, or we do have questions, and here's what they are, please answer them before we say anything more. Or we suggest that you withdraw this application. So in order, the answers come back to, yes, it's okay. No, we don't think it's okay, but we're still willing to listen. And 3, no, we don't think it's okay, please withdraw. So grass can happen for things that aren't already recognized as safe, but usually there needs to be lots of data to support it. Okay, next slide. There are some questions that have come in, and I've opened up the panel, and the first one, is there a standard of identity for RTD sangria? Ready to drink is what I assume that means.
And the answer,
Go ahead, John.
The answer to that is if it's at least 7% alcohol by volume or more, if it's a wine-based product, no, there isn't a standard of identity. In general, sangria products would fall under a wine specialty, wine with natural flavor, grape wine with natural flavors added, et cetera. But there's no real TTB definition of sangria.
Nor is there an FDA definition. If it's a wine product under 7%, though, this is a place where the juice content might need to be declared on the label. Who has jurisdiction over imported products? John, you addressed much of that before, but FDA also has jurisdiction in the same sense that it has jurisdiction over alcohol beverages for domestic manufacturers. Facility registration, GMPs, and unadulterated ingredients.
The next question here is, some food processors may want to add distilled spirits to their products, such as a bourbon barbecue sauce. My understanding is that the addition of 1.5% salt will make it a denatured product, and thus it would not be subject to TTB regs. It all depends on the alcohol being used and the amount in the finished product. There are a lot of ways to basically denature distilled spirits or any alcohol in general, depending on the amount of salt, citric acid, or others, there's an entire list that TTB has of ingredients that, when added to alcohol at certain rates, will render it unfit for beverage use. I'm not certain about 1.5% salt specifically. If you want to shoot me an email, I can double check it and let you know. But in general, yes, there are ways to denature alcohol beverages so they are no longer alcohol beverages, and you can use them in food so that it would not be subject to TTB regulations and wouldn't be taxed as an alcohol beverage.
And for the manufacturer of a product with less than 0.5% alcohol by volume, then it would not be an alcohol beverage. And making a barbecue sauce, a lot of the alcohol will get cooked off. The amount of bourbon added to the barbecue sauce might already be small enough to produce the desired effect by flavor without going over 0.5% in the finished product.
Next question is, sake is a very unique product which falls under wine and beer. Which tax rule does it fall under? On the federal level, it is taxed as beer. Certain states may tax it as wine, but the federal government taxes it as beer. It is labeled as a wine.
The next one's easy. Will we get a copy of the slides? Yes. They'll be shared after this presentation at some point. The next question, on Fda labeling requirements slide, the example ingredient statement shows contains sulfites in the ingredient statement. Typically under FDA, that is considered intervening material for food items. If an FDA regulated alcohol beverage contains sulfites, is it permissible to use contains sulfites in the ingredient statement, like what is allowed in TTB regulated products, or does a sulfite ingredient need to be labeled, i.e. potassium metabisulfite? It depends on which agency has labeling authority. If it is FDA that has labeling authority, contains sulfites, I believe it usually suffices.
So the next question is a product that has the alcohol removed still subject to taxation or TTB jurisdiction? Example, wine that has most of its alcohol removed so that the alcohol content is less than 0.5%. It is still subject to some TTB jurisdiction in that it must be produced in a bonded winery. That wine, it wouldn't be taxed because it's less than 0.5%. And it would not have TTB labeling requirements. It would be under FDA at that point. Okay. Next one is this is a good one for me. How should a sugar-based distilled product be labeled? Does it have to be rum, or can it be called a moonshine? Is there a definition of moonshine for labeling purposes like a whiskey or bourbon? Last part first, there is no federal definition of moonshine. I've seen moonshine on all manner of distilled spirits products. Some distilled from the traditional like corn and sugar, others that are, just like basically vodka with flavors added that are labeled as moonshine. Most moonshine products would be under the distilled spirit specialty category if they are distilled from sugar or a combination of sugar and corn or other grain. You don't have to call it rum. You could submit the product as a distilled spirit specialty with a formula approval saying it's distilled from 100% sugar and it doesn't if for example you're distilling it to more than 190 proof or above, it becomes neutral and it can never be rum. Or for example, if you're bottling it at less than 80 proof, it can't be rum, even if it's made from sugar. So yeah, you could submit it as a distilled spirit specialty. It would be labeled as something like spirits distilled from sugarcane or similar. But there is no definition of moonshine federally. as far as TTB is concerned.
And now, is there a regulatory requirement for a distiller to have a food safety plan? If not, is it encouraged? There is no requirement for a distiller to have a food safety plan. Distillers are specifically exempted from the requirements of the Preventive Controls section of the FSMA amendments. And it is in the Preventive Controls that a food safety plan is required. Basically, it means if you must have a preventive control, you also must have a food safety plan to describe how you're using it. If you do not have to have a preventive control, i.e. a distiller does not need to have preventive controls, you don't need a food safety plan. Whether or not it being encouraged depends entirely upon the judgment of the distiller and possibly the customers of the distiller. If a customer wants you to have it, then you can probably decide to have one. But from a regulatory standpoint, no, you are not required to have a food safety plan for making distilled alcohol beverages. And how do you determine a BUD? I think that's best used by date or expiration date. If you use a raw fruit, say a sliced apple, in a distilled beverage, say apple pie moonshine. If this is a TTB regulated requirement, regulated beverage, but basically I would think that the alcohol content acts as a sufficient preservative that you would not have decomposition of the fruit in any reasonable amount of time. It's a preservative as well as, a beverage. John, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, TTB doesn't require expiration dates for such products or any products necessarily. So, it's probably just whatever good business practices. That's what I would
And from FDA's standpoint on GMPs, the fruit would have to be sound fruit, good, not rotten or decomposed before you put it in, unless that was the intent and it's otherwise approved as an ingredient. So as long as you're using good fruit in a distilled beverage, there is no requirement for determining a best use by date. If you need to determine one, I would say that the way to do it would be to bottle it, and try it every couple of months until it doesn't taste right.
We got a couple other questions. Let's see. Charles, I think the last one might be for you. It says alcohol beverages are exempt from preventative controls, but what are the ways you can show food safety?
By complying with good manufacturing practice regulations. Now, if you have a customer who requires more than just compliance with GMPs, then you need to consider the customer's needs. But from a regulatory standpoint, there are no preventive controls necessary to produce alcohol beverages. If the customer wants you to have certification from a third party, BRC, SQF, or something like that, then you would need to look at what those non-regulatory food safety schemes say you must have in order to pass and put them into place. But understand it's because of a customer requirement that you do these things, not because of a regulatory requirement from the Food and Drug Administration.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. We are just about out of time, and I want to thank everyone in the audience today. We had a great turnout, a lot of really good questions, and of course, an excellent presentation by both Charles and John. If you have consulting or legal needs for your alcohol beverages, of course, you are invited and encouraged to reach out to either party, depending on how they're regulated or the type of question you have. With regards to the questions on GRAS, EAS does offer a number of resources on our website. We do provide GRAS services, both self-GRAS and GRAS determinations. So we would be more than happy to help there. And of course, John, as you can tell, is an excellent resource for your TTB related products in particular. So thanks everyone for joining us. I will send a copy of the slides, and we did record today's presentation. So I will include that in the copy with the slides. And with that, I say thanks so much for joining us and have a great day.